These are the pieces you will need to make your flap. This is pattern piece A. This is my exterior fabric. This is the lining. I already have my shape flex fused onto both of them. That's my lightweight interfacing. This is pattern piece B. This here, the orange, is the piece that is going to be my border. And for this method, I cut out a second of that pattern piece. I am just using a scrap of white fabric I had. You could use the same as your border piece. You could use the same as your exterior fabric. It shouldn't show, but it might a little bit along the inner edge, so whatever fabric you pick, make sure it's something that won't look odd with your other fabrics. This is your Peltex or heavy stabilizer that's going to go inside the border. Okay, so here I have my Peltex fused to one of the border pieces, and it's the white border piece, which is going to be the one that does not show, because this is the one side fusible Peltex, and I have found that fusible Peltex makes the fabric look kind of crinkly when it bends. So this is going to be on the side that will not show. It will be facing that exterior piece, and that's what will be showing. I fused it so that it's not quite 1/4 inch seam allowances around the Peltex, so I just centered it horizontally, and this is a 1/4 inch from there, and the most important thing is that this is at least a 1/4 inch from this edge, because then when you attach the flap, the Peltex won't get in the seam and make it bulky. Okay, here I have my two border pieces, right sides together. I have them clipped together, and I'm going to be stitching just along this inside edge of the Peltex. And you can go all the way to the edge there, but just the inside edge. And I'm using the zipper foot because I want to be able to stitch pretty close to the Peltex. So right up against it all the way around. Here are my two border pieces stitched together, only along the inside. My stitching is not that straight. I was doing it with one hand there. And you don't want to get too close to the Peltex or it'll strain the seam when you flip it right back out, right sides out. But if you can see there, it's, I don't know, maybe a millimeter away. And I have trimmed the seam allowances and clipped this one. I clip seam allowances by using the pinking blade from my rotary cutter because I'm lazy. So now you'll want to flip these two pieces right sides out and press the seam. Make sure you clip pretty close into the corner there. Don't cut the stitching, but as close to it as you can get. So we're flipping this right sides out. It's at first going to seem like the orange part is not big enough, but when an iron helps, and it'll make it look more like that side. My border piece is now all flipped right sides out with the seam pressed. You definitely want to make sure that you press, well, the whole thing, the whole seam you want to press, but especially at this corner, you want to make sure you get the wrinkles out, because there will be wrinkles there. And in some places I stitched maybe a tad too close to the Peltex, so those places were a little bit harder to press the seam down flat. if you put a pin or clip or something on these edges, line the edges up and pin or clip them, then, you know, that'll hold this edge and it makes it easier to press the seam down in the right place. Here I'm basting around the outside edge of the border, just outside the Peltex, and I'm doing it with the white fabric facing up because that's the one that I fused the Peltex to, so it's just easier to see the Peltex from that side. I baste around the outside. I don't have it too snug, but the basting does two things. It keeps the two layers together so they don't shift around later, and it also gives you a stitching line to follow later when you attach it, so that you can be sure you're stitching pretty close to the outside of the Peltex. Here I'm basting one more time. I have the border piece lined up on top of the exterior flap piece. The border piece is going to be a tad wider than the flap piece. That's just because the pattern piece is a little bit wider, so just center it. And the top and bottom edges should still line up. So I'm going to just follow along this line here and baste the border to the flap. Okay, my border piece is now basted to my exterior flap piece, and next I'm going to be stitching them to the flap lining piece, and that last basting step gives you a stitching line to follow that's right along the outside of the Peltex. And with this border here, I don't use twist locks or tongue locks or anything. I just use magnetic snaps, and so I don't need it to show through to the outside of the border. What I'm going to do after these pieces are stitched together and turned right sides out, they'll be like this, and I put the magnetic snap through the exterior and lining flap pieces, and then the back plate of it will be underneath the border. So I don't do any top stitching on this border yet. I need to keep it open. Here are my two flap pieces stitched together, border between them, with the seam allowance notched around the curves. And here it is, everything flipped right sides out and pressed with the iron. Your basting stitches from earlier might show. Mine show almost all the way around. And I used a contrasting thread because I didn't have orange, so I'm gonna pick out any of the basting stitches that show. And then I'm going to edge stitch along this outer edge, but again, because of the snap, I'm not going to do the inside yet. Almost finished now. I edge stitched all along the outside, including the top edge, just to base the exterior and lining together. I added a little handmade tag, and I didn't want that plate to show, so it's between the border and the flap, and the snap as well is between the border and the flap. And since I'm not doing it through the border, through the Peltex, and I didn't want to add an additional layer of Peltex there, I just like to fuse an additional layer or two of Shape Flex just to stabilize the fabric a little bit more. And so now I'm going to edge stitch along this inner edge, and it's can be tricky to do if your snap, or if you added anything else like this, if they're too close to the edge, it can be a little bit tricky, so just take your time and use the hand wheel around those parts if you have to. So here's the finished flap, and along this inside edge of the border you can see a little bit that white fabric that I used on the back of the border. So That's why you'll want to use something, probably more of this fabric, or at least this, something that it's okay to show up a little bit there. Here's the first wallet I made just for comparison. I use the wallet a lot so I don't notice so much anymore, but along these curves here, the flap and the border don't line up very well. I apparently have trouble cutting the pattern pieces out accurately because I can never make the flap and border line up. And so that's the advantage to this way. Really, the only piece I have to make sure I cut accurately is the Peltex, and everything else is just sewn around the outside of the Peltex. And it's, by the end, it's all sewn as one piece, and so there's no curves sticking out like that. And so there's our finished flap, and I hope everything was clear.